Welcome to It's Not About the Money, a podcast in search of grounded fundraising. I'm Heather, and together with my co-host Andy, we look beyond the quick tips and formulas. Join us as we explore the nuance and complexity of ministry fundraising. If you want to thrive in partner development, not just survive it, this is the place for you.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. So excited to have a guest with us today to help us recap the Josh Lindstrom episode. And he's the only guest that we've brought back so far.
Actually, not true. Carissa has come back a couple of times.
As a recapper.
That's true.
Okay. The only guest that we've brought back as our main speaker so far, just because, like we mentioned in the podcast, our number one listened to episode. So he had some great things to say about endurance, and looking forward to welcoming Dr. Mandy, newly minted Dr. Mandy. Heather, would you introduce our guest?
Absolutely. So as you said, Mandy is coming to us today. Actually, she is stateside currently, but has spent a significant amount of the past 20 years in overseas support-based ministry. And we're excited to have her joining us today to talk about her own experiences in coming up on seasons of endurance. And, part of her overseas roles have put her into leadership over teams as well as regions. So no doubt she has experienced these seasons in the lives of those that she has cared for and led. So Mandy, thank you so much for joining us on the show. And I would love to hear more about what that doctorate is.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So I received my Doctorate of Education in Organizational Change and Leadership last year from the University of Southern California. And ultimately, it's on helping with strategies and systems and looking at where organizations and companies and fellowships might be and how to give them hope for a future. It's really funny though, because I went to a school that is honestly doesn't have a lot of hope in their curriculum. And so I was definitely an outsider in a lot of conversations when, I was thinking about this endurance and fundraising and thinking through conversations I had with people who are trying to initiate and remake systems and structures within government organizations as well as school systems and things like that. And very rarely did any of it come down to a change of heart. It was all a change of system. And so I think the difference in probably my direction, even in my dissertation, was a heartitude, is what I like to call it, an attitude of the heart that's where things are going to start to change before we see changes in systems and structures. We can build systems, we can build structures, but the reality is we're sinful people and they're going to always be imperfect, and no one is ever going to be fully satisfied with them because they were made by man. But we can be fully satisfied in Christ. And so we have to start with the attitude of the heart, the heartitude, before we can change, before we can actually see joy in systems and structures, I think. So, So I did my doctoral dissertation on the impact of COVID on Christian cross-cultural workers in China. And I did qualitative research speaking with workers who were in China prior to COVID, who had experienced COVID in China, as well as what that did to their positions in China. And so some of them had returned, some of them had not. And just thinking through, honestly, the resiliency for organizations and giving from the worker's perspective, what it would take for an organization to keep them if another world trauma, pandemic, tragedy, crisis were to come forward. So
organizational endurance.
Yeah.
Just got our doctorate. Yeah.
There you go.
Well, and that just sounds like such timely and helpful insight. Because you never know what might happen. And it just seems prudent to try to be just prepared to steward people well and to meet them in their needs. And so thank you for doing that.
And I even wondered domestically, how many churches are prepared for succession, right? For someone to take the reins after a head pastor or whatever is ready to retire.
Or even domestically, how many churches were prepared for what COVID would mean for ongoing church life. I think the American church is still recovering.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing about that, Mandy. I'm also curious. I know that you have been in support-based work for about 20 years. I'm curious whether that's been with one company in one location or if that's been a myriad of experiences for you.
Yeah, it's actually a myriad. I started with a mobilization organization from Texas to Colorado. I was living on support in Colorado, which is nuts.
Yeah.
I even had one person ask me, because Texas thinks Colorado's its playground. And so, and that's an issue of pride we have down here. So just hold it loosely. I had one guy, I remember very distinctly, he said, "So you want me to support you to live in Colorado?"
In the playground?
He could not grasp.
Yeah.
And he didn't quite get the why behind it.
Uh-huh.
Right.
So that was the first. And then I worked for another organization, and I was still raising support, and that was focused solely on East Asia. And then third company is the one I'm currently with. So yes, I've been with three. The first one, unfortunately, actually went bankrupt, and I lost all my support that I had held. That was really tough.
Worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah. The second one, it had just a very different perspective on how to raise funds and what not to say. Actually, it's at the time, it's changed a little bit now from what I understand, but at the time, the organization prefer us not ask for money at all.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so we were to raise support solely on faith without even giving explanation, without ever asking for a dime.
But Mandy, you would reach out to people in the same way, I'm guessing. You would send them newsletters or sit down with them face to face, but you just wouldn't say, "Would you think about supporting me?"
Absolutely. Yeah, we did. Okay. We sent newsletters. We would do presentations in homes and fellowships, and they were always constantly on us about raising, but we never once said, "Would you consider?" We never asked once, "Would you fund me?"
I've met people like that. And the question that I always have is, why are we drawing the line right there?
Good question.
I don't know.
Yeah. I think some of that even comes from an old tradition. I think it was like old cross-cultural workers like Hudson Taylor, Adoniram Judson, those guys, I don't think they asked for support. And I think they had different reasons, but I also think it was a different time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, great. Thank you so much for giving us a little bit of insight into your journey. And I'm excited for this conversation to come. So guys, in thinking about the episode we had with Josh on endurance, what stood out?
Can we just talk about Woodman's Sabbath, year of Sabbath?
Yes. So cool.
Yeah. I was thinking about Sabbath is no easy thing to do, to live in. And I would even dare to say that becoming disciplined in Sabbath you have to endure some hardship to even get to a place of being a disciplined Sabbath taker. I know it has for me. And so I just really appreciated that the fellowship that Josh leads just did it as a body. And I'm sure it wasn't easy for all of them, but so much intentionality is needed in taking Sabbath. It's needed in raising funds. It's just intentionality is just needed in being a disciple of Jesus, right? Like, period. So
absolutely.
I was really proud of them for doing that and making it a necessary. So I also actually was at one of the conferences where Josh talked about Elijah and endurance.
Oh yeah.
And where he's talking about Elijah losing his focus. What stood out to me in that and thinking through, especially through fundraising, because I'm definitely talking to myself here. I would say that we lose our focus sometimes when we're fundraising. I do, where my focus becomes more on the fundraising, not the why, even though I'm telling people why I need the funds. I'm telling people what it is to do, what it is to be a partner with me in this work. But my focus on the why is constantly being neglected. And what I mean by that is often I am praying more for the funds than I am for the nation or the people, or honestly, just not resting in what he would have for me in that moment. Even it's more of I go with this agenda of fundraising, and I need to hit these check marks. I don't think that's necessarily bad, but if I'm doing it without having first sat in rest with him and really praying to the Father on the behalf of the things, the why of why I'm fundraising, I think I'm missing maybe even some real blessings from the Lord.
Yeah.
And Josh was just, I really appreciate Josh reminding us during his talk on endurance, at least at the conference, that we are constantly in a spiritual battle. Like it doesn't stop.
Right.
And so, and it's just, it reminds me actually of a story that my dad told me about a pastor that came out of Houston. His name is Dr. Ed Young. And he's a pastor in the early 90s. Pastor Young, or Dr. Young, he stood up against the Texas government because they were trying to put the lottery in Texas.
Okay.
And the Christian community did not want it. And Ed Young, along with a couple others, were standing up, and he was probably one of the only like mega church pastors at the time that actually was making a ruckus and trying to fight against it. And ultimately, the state won the vote. And so anyway, after the vote, this local news agency or local news station interviewed Dr. Young, and the journalist said something like, "So how do you feel about losing?" And Dr. Young, he sort of chuckled, and he shook his head, and he said something to the tune of, "We haven't lost anything." He said, "We may have lost this battle, but our victory has already been won. And so we're just fighting in obedience the battle the Lord places in front of us." The state won the vote, but we haven't lost anything. And I think about that, of that perspective that Dr. Young had, in that he knew the why. It didn't matter the outcome.
Yeah.
And
That's great.
And I know for me, that's like, if I don't get funding at something, sometimes I'm a little discouraged. But when it comes back to the why, it doesn't matter, because even my prayers are more powerful than my presence in a country. And so if I'm being postured to really keep my eyes on the why, that's prayer in Jesus. And me getting there is a good idea. Obviously, it's what he would have for me. But even when and how is less important than the why. And so that's something that really stuck out to me when Josh was talking about the focus of Elijah.
Yeah. And I guess what you just said reminds me even of when Josh brought up the parable of the sower, and how we think the point is what kind of soil it's landing on. Whereas, there's an invitation to see that the sower just keeps sowing.
Yeah.
And that his work is to just keep sowing. So yeah, that comes to mind with what you just said.
And it makes me think too of the flip side of the argument I was trying to make earlier, that maybe one of the benefits of not asking directly for money is that you can't help but be focused on the why more than the bottom line. I think the part that stood out to me, honestly, was early on, because I resonated with it. Like, sometimes you just need a snack and a couple of naps.
Yeah.
Isn't that so true?
It's so true. And like, don't make decisions when you're tired and hangry.
Well, yeah. And it reminds me of the episode we recently released with Amy Young, just talking about your humanity in fundraising.
Right.
And gosh, that's such a human thing. And it's not a bad thing.
No.
It's not a bad thing that we are dependent on rest and sustenance, and that those things are actually reviving to us.
Those limitations are part of our design.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. They're just one way that we're formed into understanding that we're not like all sufficient, Something else that I was reminded of from the episode, from what you said, Mandy, is just, you said that in the conference, he drew out the point that we are always in a battle. And I did appreciate in our conversation with him, just as he was holding the tension of, you're going to come up on difficult circumstances, and you should not necessarily be disheartened by that because you are in a battle,
Yeah.
And sometimes that is an invitation to, or it's always, I guess, an invitation to formation. Sometimes it might be the Lord's care in leading you through something. And sometimes it might just be straight up opposition from the enemy. And holding those in tension, I think he spoke really well to that.
And I liked his analogy, like, don't sign up to be a soldier if you aren't ready to be shot at.
Yeah, I think that's helpful.
Yeah.
And just helpful to be reminded, like, oh yeah, it is normal to come up on disruption and obstacles.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciated that too. And the question of Josh saying, if God's in it, it should be easier, right? And I just appreciated that because I was teaching a lesson recently on God's promises of blessing from Genesis. And I had to emphasize the blessings that he gave to Abram in Genesis 12, but and those were awesome. Like, I'm so grateful for those blessings that he was giving Abraham, but they never once said that they would come without suffering, those blessings, nor were there a lot of details other than God saying, go to the land I will show you. It wasn't even specific yet at that point where he was going.
Start walking.
And then when you jump to Genesis 15, Abram had just won this little war, and God tells him he's going to make his descendants uncountable like the stars. And you're just going, whoa. But that wasn't going to come about easily. And we all know the case that somehow we often forget and just expect that because God told us something, he told us to go to a place, he told us he's going to provide for us to get there, that we're going to get the outcome without having to endure the hardship in the process.
Yeah.
And then when the hardship comes, we end up taking our eyes off of him. And I know I've done that multiple times. And so, but you're right. I do appreciate that too. It's not just easier because the Lord told us it was what we were going to do.
Right.
Yeah.
I think I resonated too with this idea. How do we know when we just need the snap? Or how do we know that the Lord isn't asking us to push through? Like, we have back to back this example of God leading Elijah to rest, but then also, like, don't wallow in the cave and just kind of be in your misery looking for and kind of feeling sorry for yourself. So I feel like much of life is maybe about finding that balance. In this case, like, you have on one side the overwork and the burnout. On the other side, maybe though, you have like the fear and the hiding and like the abandoning of a mission. So I guess I'm wondering, Mandy, like, you've been in a lot of different contexts on the field, and have you seen any of these scenarios play out like this?
Where people just give up? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Or have you seen them? I guess, have you seen them wrestle with that dichotomy or have those questions?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you have some people who are working so hard to get that funding. They get the funding to get on the field, and then they get to the field and the funding drops off. Yeah. And some of them it becomes such a burden that they burn out. Even though, and they burn out more because of the funding that's not yet there than the work they're doing, right? So they allow things to burden them. They allow fundraising to burden them to the place of, I got to quit this now because this isn't the way I had it planned, or my partners aren't participating like I thought they would. And if that were the case, I personally would have quit a long time ago if that were necessary. So you have to learn to connect with people when you're at a place where you can connect with people. And I know there have been times like for me personally, I've been in the States now for almost 2 years, which was never my expectation. And I took a 6-month sabbatical, I guess. And I told my people, I'm probably not going to write to you in 6 months. And I just need you to know that. And that was really helpful for me to not have to think about what I'm writing, not have to think about telling them where I'm at. And then people would call and just check on me, and I appreciated it. But I didn't have to get out newsletters for those 6 months because I told people I wasn't connecting. I was taking time off, and that was helpful. We don't learn to like intentionally take those Sabbath breaks. We're going to quit way before it's necessary.
Right.
If we don't take those rests, if we don't take those snacks. And I think part of that too is something that I've found is I read a lot of books on Sabbath, and I look at what people are saying to do. And then I look at the word of God, and I look at how Jesus did it. And it wasn't quite as extravagant as how Mandy wants to do it. Sometimes Sabbath was just an hour in the morning. I mean, he obviously took Sabbath because he was a Jew, and they took a holy day, right? But Jesus, in the midst of everything he did, he just took an hour here and an hour there. And that in and of itself is a discipline, right? Because somebody's going to text you, or somebody's going to need you, and you have to learn how to build that into your life. And that even goes into that 2 Thessalonians, like pray without ceasing. You build that into your life. And that takes intentionality. And I think even like when we're fundraising, or whether we're on the field fundraising and trying to get people, you think, oh, I'll get there and I'll have stories to tell. And then I know Josh pointed this out too, and I really appreciated it, where he pointed out, this kid, or something about a babysitter and working with a babysitter that day. And just talking about the time of prayer there, that really resonated with me, because I'm constantly looking for these experiences that are worth writing about and telling people about, whether that's in a video or a newsletter. And I really appreciated hearing from him that as a reader of people's newsletters, he just wants to hear what we're doing in connecting with the Lord. And not so much of how many people we saw dunked one day, and not that that's not something to celebrate.
Right.
But it doesn't stop there. And I wonder if we end up surrendering the wrong things when we're on the field because of finances. And what I mean by that is, like, are we sacrificing versus surrendering? Are we sacrificing our holy times in a good way for the sake of trying to raise funds? Or are we surrendering our fundraising so that we can have time with the Lord? Like, so there's like this, and so the sacrifice of our time with him is actually hurting us. Whereas if we were to surrender our funding to him so that we had time with him, it would be helping us. And so I'm thinking about people who have literally lost their way because the burden of fundraising, they ended up sacrificing what God could have done in them and through them because they were too burdened by the money.
And maybe it's harder for those of us who are like high activators, highly responsible. Like we have this idea of like this American efficiency that we bring with us from our home culture to the field. And we think that, man, just sitting and being still feels like a spiritual blessing, but it's not actually getting the work done. So I gotta focus somewhere else.
Yeah.
Very true.
Yeah, man, there's so many things from what you just said, Mandy, but I guess kind of going back to the very beginning of when you were identifying that you took a sabbatical and that for 6 months you kind of prepped your partners to not hear from you. I just wanted to point out that I think that is really wonderful. I'm grateful that you had that kind of freedom and rest. And I think that was probably possible because that was front-loaded, or not necessarily front-loaded, but that was preceded by communication, right? Like for years, they've heard from you, you've communicated, you've done the work of building trust so that when you get to a point where you say, hey, you're not going to hear from me, there's been a lot of work to bring you to that point. You see what I'm saying? And that reminds me of just a comment that Josh made. He said that we're called to engage in real work to get there, and real work is tiring. It's just good to see, yes, fundraising is really tiring work. It's diligence. I mean, communication with people, it is work. but that work bears out in opportunity to rest, in that developed rapport and in that mutual respect and things like that.
Yeah, we have the license to rest from that work as well.
Yeah.
And actually the expectation that we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also, it probably would have felt very different to Mandy's partners if she hadn't had a pattern of communicating with them and then all of a sudden went dark for several months. Right. I'm just pointing to the really good hard work that led up to that kind of trust and
That's
freedom.
Good.
Yeah. I also really appreciated you commenting on how Josh talked about the beauty and the gospel work that's being done in somebody babysitting and praying over those kids, right? Like just acclimating your partners to see the beauty in the mundane and honestly, just kind of normalizing that the lives they find themselves in are rich with opportunities for gospel work, you know?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I, it really resonated with me because when I became a leader in the organization that I'm currently in, and I began working with colleagues in my field more than like the local people, because as a leader, I definitely had local relationships, but I wasn't out with new people on a regular basis. I struggled to know what to write to partners back home. And honestly, at times there were things that were very difficult. I mean, you're dealing with people. I mean, we might be workers overseas, but we're still sinful people. And and we have to deal with the lives of the cross-cultural workers trying to live their lives out in obedience. It's no easy task, but that's not always something I can write about, especially because oftentimes it was other people's stories to tell, not my own.
Yeah.
And so I had to learn to be really intentional about writing down and taking note of the small things, the small good things that happened. I literally would leave a voicemail or do a voice message to myself on my phone when a student or an old friend would meet me for a coffee and just talk about that conversation, just try to find highlights for that because I wanted to tell people about it. So I really appreciated what Josh said about sharing the babysitter story. I need to think more about those sweet times with the Father as worthy of sharing too.
Yeah.
Like how to make day-to-day life approachable to the reader and listener. And I just appreciate that Josh is one who reads and hears these things. And so that gives me insight to go, oh, if he likes that, maybe others would be willing to, that would be okay for me to write to others as well. So that was really good for me. Just recognizing too, I think that even comes down to that. It's a theology of work that comes right in helping people recognize their part in what they play wherever they are and whatever they're doing as well.
Yeah, because, he made another comment. I think it was actually in relation to the widow's mite and celebrating what God celebrates. And even if it's a seemingly small amount, maybe it doesn't move your profile along very much, how actually in God's sight, there was obedience. And that is, he took loaves and fishes and multiplied them beyond what we can imagine, right? So he certainly celebrates even the smallest of gifts, and to kind of translate it away from money and thinking about the way we look at ministry. We can be very quick to diminish things that are very much ministry, but not consider them as such because they don't look like this, or they're not. I heard you say that when you pivoted from working with local people to colleagues, that you felt a little bit of the difference in how will I communicate this? And I'm just, in my own life, sometimes I catch myself diminishing the ministry and role I have as mom, thinking, goodness, I need to be doing more investing in other women, or I need to be, stepping into this ministry that's seeking people. So I think we can just be quick to not see things as ministry when they're absolutely the Lord's portion and ask of our ministry right now,
Absolutely.
And I feel like that's something that is unique that a missionary can bring to the table, because we're expecting to hear stories of success and good things. That's not something that we typically talk about in the normal kind of American church. in my experience, like we're not running like newsletter updates to each other.
Right.
Right. But if a field worker, if a missionary can normalize and even celebrate these micro wins and these little steps of faithfulness and model that for everybody else, I think that can be a really helpful way to minister to everybody else.
Yeah. And I guess back to another recap that we had with Bernie recently, it shows that people in support-based work aren't like superhuman, doing superhuman things.
Right.
They're also normal people trying to be obedient to Jesus. Yeah.
He talked about something from Spurgeon early on. Where Spurgeon,
the fainting fits. Yeah,
the fainting fits.
Yeah.
And I hadn't heard about that, but just let's call to attention like this reality that the Lord does these things to keep us grounded, right? And he even gives the Apostle Paul this thorn, and he says, "My grace is sufficient for you." Like, why does he do these things? It can be tempting when everybody else sees this missionary as a hero to not just take on that mantle for yourself and say, "Yeah, you know what? I kind of am a hero." And so these fits of fainting, I think, are helpful. And I like the analogy and the metaphor that he used about a knife needing to be sharpened. And if you just are consistently using it, it's gonna be dull. You're gonna be numb. So maybe, Mandy, to bring you back into this perspective as well, like it's important to stay sharp. But I imagine the temptation when somebody is listening for them to think, okay, so I need to add stay sharp to my list of things to do. So how does somebody actually, in this context, how does actually somebody do that? And what would you suggest to somebody, one of these colleagues maybe that you're coaching?
I had a housemate in Southeast Asia who was really good at sharpening herself. And I learned from her. I'll tell you, I'm still not quite there, but she would work, and then she begins to recognize she's dulling herself to the point of you get on edge with people pretty fast, and all of a sudden, even after you've lived in a country for 10 years, all of a sudden you walk outside and everything is wrong.
Yes.
That's just that culture shock comes in, and you're thinking, why is this a problem? I've lived here this long and it didn't bug me before, kind of thing.
Why is it still raining?
Exactly. Why is it still hot?
Yeah.
But she would then just say, okay, I need to take a weekend off. And if she even had things on her calendar, she would cancel them so that she could be at her best when it came back to it. And I really appreciated that about watching her do that, because she was willing to cut things off so that she could be at her best. And I think that's the same. There was just a discipline of sharpening herself, so that she could come back and do her best work. And I think about that too, just as even like I was talking about a theology of work before, in who we are, no matter what we're doing on the field, no matter what type of work we're doing on the field, we have to be excellent. We have to be good at what we do. And I'll be honest, I am not a perfectionist naturally.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a lot for me to do things like to set myself apart and say, I am actually really good at this. Because I'm one who's like, if it gets done, it gets done kind of mentality. That's my natural perspective.
Okay.
And so, but I think as a Christian, on the field and even in our fundraising, we have to set ourselves apart in how we approach the work that we do, how we approach our fundraising. And in that excellence you have to have a sharp blade to do the work well. And so if we're going to be excellent, then we're going to have to build in, and that comes back to that intentionality, the intentional rest, and the intentional play, even just the different spiritual disciplines that some of us need to place in our lives to sharpen ourselves for continued work. And I think that's so vital. And I saw it in people, and I saw people who didn't do it, and they continued to do the work, and they were the most horrible people to be around, even though they were brothers and sisters.
Even if they were taking a quote unquote coffee break, they just were not pleasant to be around. But that's because they were so dull, and they were dull spiritually, they were dull emotionally, they were dull mentally. They were burned out is what was happening.
Numb.
And I think a lot of that is because they weren't taking the time they needed.
Yeah. Yeah. And man, it can just be so hard to realize that's what you need. Sometimes I kind of wish, like Elijah, an angel would just show up with food and tell us to take a nap, because we can be so slow on the uptake on like what we actually need, and I think that speaks to the importance of community that you've invested in and given the space to like speak into your life and kind of say hard things when they need to, and ultimately there's only so much other people can do to show themselves to be a safe space for you. You have to let them be, so there's just so much that's not controllable about that, but it's really hard to live in this tension, always knowing that by the Spirit, we are growing and the Lord is forming us more into the likeness of Himself. And with that, we should expect to see change and growth and maturity. And we are never going to be optimized, and we are never going to get to the point where we don't need more pruning and formation until we are perfected after Christ has come. Yeah. So that can be a tricky tension to live in,
Perpetual sanctification.
Perpetual sanctification, but to rest in that,
That's normal. That's the expectation.
Yeah. Well, I know our time is drawing close to done, but there's one more idea I want to sneak in here, and that's just that he said that sometimes you think it's about endurance, but really it's just patience. And he talked about Moses and how Moses spent all this time apprenticing to his father-in-law and then never had his own flock, but that the Lord was preparing him in a very different way to lead a people, out of Egypt. And so I'm just curious how that struck you guys, or whether that differentiating endurance and patience, how that hit you.
As I think about that, it hadn't hit me until just now. So thank you for bringing that up. Actually. Where I'm at in life, in fundraising, in overseas ministry, is not where I would have thought I would have been 20 years ago. And so I'm grateful. And what's interesting too is even just recently, some things have come onto my plate about my future. And a lot of it is actually going to utilize the things I learned at the beginning of 20 years ago that I haven't been able to really implement quite as much in what I'm doing right now. And so it's been really interesting to see how when we reflect back on what he's doing, and I'm sure it was the same with Moses, he was teaching him how to lead a flock because he was leading people through a desert. Right. And he had to learn some basic skills that he wouldn't have learned otherwise. And that the Lord, nothing that he gives us in his sovereignty, nothing that he gives us is not usable at some point in our lives. The opportunities that we have, the lessons that we've learned. And so we just long to control it and not allow the sovereign one to lead it. And I think a lot of times we begin to understand that more when we take those times of rest, when we eat those snacks, when we find time for play and to just sit with the Father in fellowship.
Take your hands off the wheel for a while.
Absolutely. And, in good old Carrie Underwood, let Jesus take that wheel, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so true. And such a good point for us to wrap up our conversation on just the importance of surrender, as you said earlier, and just really entrusting ourselves to the Lord, believing that He can and does use our circumstances and our experiences for our own good and for the good of others.
And I guess for my final thought would be, and he said it was cliche, but I don't know if I've heard it put quite this way before, that God wants us holy. He doesn't necessarily want us happy. That was, I think, it felt important to me, and that God does discipline people that he loves.
As an Enneagram 7, I wonder if that hits you in a particular way.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
It's fantastic, the truth. And this even like resonates with the sermon that we heard last Sunday. And that's not to say that all of suffering and whatever is related to our sin or whatever.
Yeah.
But I thought maybe I'll end with a passage of scripture.
That sounds great.
So this is Hebrews 12, verse 3 through 8. It says, "For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, so that you won't grow weary and give up. In struggling against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And you have forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons. My son, do not take the Lord's discipline lightly or lose heart when you are reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and punishes every son he receives. Endure suffering and discipline. God is dealing with you as sons. For what son is there that a father does not discipline? But if you are without discipline, which all receive, then you are illegitimate children and not sons." So that's not to say that everything you suffer is a response from the Lord, right, for something that you've done wrong, right? But let's also not run away from it, right? Because we have biblically the examples of Job and Jonah. That was from that sermon, right? So Job, we know, wasn't doing anything wrong. But Jonah obviously was running away from God. And then the enemy is also involved too. Like Josh points that out as well. So to approach it with an open hand and with an open mind and just say, Lord, what do you want to teach me through this? Is there something I need to repent of? Or how are you going to be glorified in the midst of what I'm going through right now?
Well, Mandy, this has been a really rich and wonderful time. Thank you so much for taking the time to unpack this episode with us. And listeners, we hope and pray that it is an encouragement to you. And as always, if you have questions or thoughts about it, ping us. We've got the ability to text us in our show notes or send an email to Andy or I, and we would be happy to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Mandy. Dr. Mandy, it was so good to have you here.
Thank you so much. It was so great to be here.
It's Not About the Money is presented by Provisio Fundraising Solutions. Provisio equips support-based workers with flexible training, practical resources, and one-on-one coaching. Find out more at provisiofundraising.com.